Perry's mission: America's rise as a Pacific power. Perry's successful mission to Japan marked not just the end of Japanese isolation, but the beginning of America's emergence as a Pacific power. For Americans watching these events unfold, Perry's expedition represented their nation's growing global reach. Just 7 decades after gaining independence, the United States was projecting power across the world's largest ocean. The American press celebrated Perry as a national hero who had opened a mysterious Oriental kingdom without firing a shot. Harper's new monthly magazine published illustrations of the American squadron towering over Japanese boats, a visual metaphor for the perceived technological and cultural superiority of the West. Yet, American perceptions of their role in Japan were often simplistic and self-congratulatory. Most Americans viewed themselves as benevolent harbingers of progress, bringing the backward Japanese into the modern world. Few understood that they were dealing with a sophisticated civilization with its own complex history and goals. The reality of Japan's opening was far messier and more violent than most Americans realized. The treaties that followed Perry's mission set off a chain reaction of internal conflict that would claim tens of thousands of Japanese lives. The American concept of opening Japan ignored the agency of the Japanese themselves in determining their nation's fate. Let's examine what Japan's 2 centuries of isolation really meant, and what lessons it holds for understanding international relations even today. First, we must recognize that sakoku was not simply a reflexive fear of foreigners, as it's often portrayed. It was a sophisticated policy designed to solve specific problems facing the early Tokugawa shoguns. The primary goal was not to keep foreign goods out. Japan had always valued trade, but to keep foreign influences, particularly Christianity and European power politics, from destabilizing the newly established Tokugawa regime. The policy succeeded brilliantly in this regard. While continental Asia was carved up by colonial powers and much of Southeast Asia fell under European control, Japan maintained its independence. The Philippines, seized by Spain in the 16th century and later transferred to American control, offers a stark contrast to Japan's experience. The isolation policy also allowed the Tokugawa shogunate to consolidate power internally. By controlling foreign trade, the shogun deprived potential rivals of independent access to firearms and foreign allies. Regional daimyo, who might otherwise have formed alliances with European powers against the central government, as happened in India, were kept in check. Perhaps most significantly, the sakoku period saw the development of a distinctly Japanese cultural identity. Without constant influxes of foreign ideas and products, Japanese arts, literature, and philosophy flourished in unique directions. The ukiyo-e prints that would later influence European impressionists, the haiku poetry of Matsuo Basho, the elegant simplicity of Japanese design, all reached their height during this period of limited foreign contact. But isolation also created vulnerabilities. Japan's military technology stagnated while Western nations experienced the Industrial Revolution. By Perry's arrival, the technological gap had become unbridgeable. Japanese cannons were centuries out of date. Their naval vessels were designed for coastal defense, not open ocean warfare. More subtly, isolation fostered a dangerous complacency among Japan's ruling class. The samurai, once a dynamic warrior class, had become bureaucrats and courtiers, more concerned with status and ceremony than military effectiveness. The rigid social hierarchy, with merchants officially at the bottom despite their growing wealth, created tensions that undermined the regime from within. The end of isolation revealed these weaknesses catastrophically. When faced with Western military technology, Japan's defenses proved inadequate. The political system, designed for stability and isolation, couldn't adapt quickly enough to external pressures. This leads us to a fascinating counterfactual question. What if Japan had never isolated itself? What if it had continued the path of openness and engagement with Europe that characterized the 16th century? Some historians argue that without isolation, Japan might have become a colonial subject like much of Asia. The early Christian converts could have formed a fifth column for European powers, as happened elsewhere. Without the breathing space provided by isolation, Japan might never have developed the strong national identity that later enabled it to resist colonization. Others contend that a more open Japan might have industrialized earlier, maintaining military parity with Western powers and avoiding the traumatic opening altogether. After all, Japan demonstrated remarkable ability to absorb and adapt foreign technologies once the isolation policy ended. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. Japan's geography, an island nation far from European power centers, provided natural protection that continental Asian countries lacked. Yet without the cohesive national identity formed during isolation, Japan might have been more vulnerable to divide and conquer strategies used by colonial powers elsewhere. What's undeniable is that Japan's response to the end of isolation stands as one of history's most remarkable national transformations. The Meiji Restoration that followed Perry's arrival launched a comprehensive program of modernization that touched every aspect of Japanese society. The feudal domains were abolished and replaced with prefectures. The four-class social system was dismantled. Universal education was established, leading to near-total literacy by the early 20th century. A modern army and navy were created, based initially on French and British models. Banking, postal, and railway systems were built from scratch. Most revolutionary of all, the samurai, Japan's hereditary warrior class for nearly 1,000 years, lost their special privileges. Their stipends were commuted to government bonds. Their exclusive right to bear arms was abolished. Many former samurai became teachers, entrepreneurs, or government officials in the new Japan. This transformation was driven by a remarkable group of young leaders. Many had been low or middle-ranking samurai from domains traditionally opposed to the shogunate. They recognized that Japan needed fundamental change to survive in the modern world, and they were willing to sacrifice centuries of tradition to achieve it. Their slogan, "Enrich the country, strengthen the military," captured their dual focus on economic development and national defense. Unlike China, which attempted to adopt Western military technology while maintaining traditional social structures, Japan understood that comprehensive change was necessary. The speed of this transformation astonished Western observers. In 1872, just 18 years after Perry's arrival, Japan opened its first railway line. By 1890, it had a written constitution and an elected parliament. In 1895, it defeated China in war, securing Taiwan as its first colony. In 1905, it became the first Asian nation in modern times to defeat a European power when it triumphed over Russia. By 1912, when Emperor Meiji died, Japan had transformed from an isolated feudal society into a modern industrial power and imperial nation with colonies in Taiwan and Korea. This Meiji miracle stands as one of history's most successful examples of rapid modernization. Yet this transformation came at a cost. The breakneck pace of change created social dislocations that would trouble Japan for generations. The transition from a feudal economy to industrial capitalism led to exploitation of workers, particularly women and children in textile factories. Traditional social bonds were broken, creating new forms of poverty and alienation. Moreover, Japan's success in adopting Western methods gave rise to a dangerous militarism. Having seen how Western powers used military force to secure colonial possessions, many Japanese leaders concluded that Japan must do the same to be recognized as an equal. The victories over China and Russia encouraged an expansionist outlook that would eventually lead to tragedy. The legacy of isolation and its sudden end continues to shape Japan today. modern Japanese society still navigates the tension between global engagement and cultural distinctiveness. Japan remains extraordinarily successful at adapting foreign innovations while maintaining its unique identity, a skill honed during both the Shogun period and the Meiji modernization. For Americans, the opening of Japan represents an important chapter in our emergence as a Pacific power. Perry's expedition began a relationship between Japan and America that has encompassed commerce, cultural exchange, bitter warfare, and eventually a strong alliance. Today, as American strategic focus shifts increasingly toward Asia, understanding this complex history becomes ever more important. What lessons can we draw from this remarkable historical episode? First, isolation, even when nearly complete, is never absolute. Despite its closed country policy, Japan maintained awareness of the outside world through carefully controlled channels. Information, like water, finds ways to flow even through the smallest openings. Second, technological gaps, once they become too wide, create nearly irresistible power imbalances. Japan's decision to limit firearm development during the Tokugawa period left it vulnerable when confronted with 19th-century Western military technology. Today's strategic planners might see parallels in fields like artificial intelligence or biotechnology. Third, cultural adaptation requires selective borrowing, not wholesale imitation. Japan's success in modernization came from its ability to adopt useful foreign practices while maintaining its cultural core. The Japanese spirit, Western technology approach created a distinctive path to modernity. Fourth, the trauma of forced opening, being made to engage with the global system on unfavorable terms, can create lasting resentments. Japan's experience with unequal treaties and the humiliation of gunboat diplomacy contributed to its later militarism and imperial ambitions. Similar patterns can be seen in China's century of humiliation and its current assertive stance in international affairs. Finally, isolation, while sometimes protective, eventually becomes unsustainable in an interconnected world. No nation, no matter how powerful or distinctive, can remain completely separate from global systems indefinitely. The question is not whether to engage with the outside world, but how to do so on terms that preserve core values and interests. Japan's journey from isolation to global power remains one of history's most fascinating transformations. The Sakoku policy, intended as a temporary measure by its creators, lasted for more than 2 centuries, shaping Japan in ways that continue to resonate today. And when isolation ended, Japan demonstrated an extraordinary capacity for reinvention, becoming within a single lifetime the first non-Western nation to achieve industrial and military parity with the West. As we confront our own era's challenges of globalization, technological disruption, and shifting power balances, Japan's experience offers valuable insights. How nations navigate between openness and protection, between cultural preservation and necessary change, between independence and interdependence. These questions are as relevant today as they were when black ships appeared on Japan's horizon nearly 170 years ago. The story of Japan's isolation and opening reminds us that history is never simple, that national policies have complex origins and unforeseen consequences, and that cultural encounters, even when begun through force or threat, can ultimately lead to mutual enrichment and understanding. Thank you for watching this exploration of one of history's most fascinating chapters. If you enjoyed learning about Japan's period of isolation and its dramatic opening to the world, please consider subscribing to our channel for more deep dives into Asian history and culture. Don't forget to like this video and share it with friends who might be interested in this remarkable story. Stay tuned for our next episode, where we'll explore another hidden chapter of history that shaped our modern world.